I'm Aleezeh Fatima from DawnNews English, and you're watching Front Seat to Climate Change. Every year, Pakistan faces deeper climate shocks, floods that swallow districts, heat waves that push people to the edge, and storms we simply are not prepared for. But these disasters are not just natural, they are shaped by history, power, and inequality. And that brings us to today's episode, climate colonialism, a term that's becoming central to global climate debates but is still misunderstood. To unpack it, we spoke to Ahmad Rafay Alam, environmental lawyer and former member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council. Climate colonialism argues that the climate crisis is not an accident, it's the outcome of centuries of extraction. For context, the world's richest countries, a small percentage of the global population, are responsible for the majority of historical greenhouse gas emissions, while regions like South Asia contributed little but face the harshest impacts today. That's why this framework matters. It connects past exploitation with the present suffering. Let's hear from Rafi more. So my first question to you is that when we talk about climate colonialism, what exactly do we mean and how is it different from just calling it climate injustice?
That's a great question. And to understand climate colonialism and indeed climate injustice, you have to understand that beyond climate change being caused by greenhouse gases or the burning of fossil fuels in our human food consumption, the drivers of the climate crisis have been colonialism, capitalism, and consumerism. And when you understand this, you begin to understand where climate colonialism comes from. The colonial practice of many countries historically extracted resources and abused the human labor of other parts of the world to create immense riches in the hands of a few people, a few corporations, and a few countries, creating, well, frankly, poverty and injustice in the rest of the world. And it was this resource extraction by these colonial countries, often using capitalist devices such as companies and subsequently loans, that have indebted smaller countries or less developed countries in the world. But anyway, these more developed countries have extracted resources through this colonial and capital process and have then produced greenhouse gases, causing essentially the climate crisis that we face today. And that's what we call climate colonialism. And the injustice in this is that so few people in so few countries have burnt fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution, leaving the rest of the world, the global majority, the global South, facing a civilizational collapse. That, in essence, is this climate injustice.
Countries like Pakistan did not industrialize early, but we inherited a climate already destabilized by the centuries of fossil fuel driven growth. The science is clear. Historical emissions continue to heat the planet today, long after they were released. And yet, the regions that emitted the least, like South Asia, Africa, and small island states, are where climate disasters hit first and hit hardest. Now, we will speak to Rafi about how history still dictates who suffers the most today. Brings me to my next question, and every time we talk about climate colonialism, we really need to dive into the history, that how did it start. So I want to ask you that how do the historical emissions of the global north still determine the climate realities of the country in the global south today, which are like the most vulnerable to climate change right now?
Well, the colonial practices actually started over things like spices, nutmeg, sugar, tea, and in our part of the world, pepper, which slowly grew into once the energy source of the world converted from coal to petroleum. It soon grew to the extraction of fossil fuels around the world in Indonesia, in the Middle East, and in South America. And in this process, starting from spices, the extraction of resources and abuse of labor continued with the extraction now of more fossil fuels and indeed the suppression of now what we call human rights. This is the cause of the greenhouse gases, the historical emissions. Because if you look at small countries like Pakistan or less developed countries or small island states, historically they're very small emitters. Pakistan today emits just a fraction of a percent of overall greenhouse gas emissions, whereas it's the global 20, the G20, the largest 20 economies on Earth right now, that produce about 80% year on year of global greenhouse gases. And it's this massive disproportion in the consumption of resources, the extraction and consumption of resources that leads to the production of greenhouse gases, that basically leads to this situation where a handful of countries are responsible for the emissions historically, and the rest of the world is paying not just the climate crisis debt, but the finance debt from it as well.
So, why is it that the regions contributing the least to the global emissions, which are South Africa,
South Asia, small island states, which is something that you have mentioned in your answer as well, are often the ones that hit first and hit the hardest.
Well, there's no country that's not safe from the climate crisis. I'll remind you that in Europe, just this year, there were heat waves. In the United States, massive
Mhm.
floods in Texas. So it's not as if global north countries aren't susceptible to climate change. The whole world is. It's just that they have the resources and the money to be able to stand back on their feet once they experience a climate event. That's called resilience. And that capacity and finances, the ability to get back on your feet, i.e., resilience, is missing in the poorer countries of the world, which is the global majority. So, what happens is when it rains in Pakistan, what should be contained flooding winds up impacting millions of people because their homes are eroded, their roads are eroded, their schools and hospitals are eroded, and then our state doesn't have the capacity and the finances to be able to reorder those things within a reasonable amount of time. The floods in Punjab and in KPK this year, the destruction that they brought in those areas will take years, if not decades, to replace. We will have a generation of children who don't have access to healthcare, a generation of children whose schools have been taken away. And it'll take years to rebuild the roads, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure for these communities to bring them back on their feet. And it's in this way that less developed countries are more vulnerable, although the entire globe is equally vulnerable to climate crisis.
As climate disasters grow, the demand for restitution grows with them. The Loss and Damage Fund is supposed to help vulnerable nations recover from climate devastation, the floods, the droughts, and storms we cannot adapt away from. But the reality is that the scale of funding pledged so far is nowhere near what's needed. At COP28, roughly $700 million were pledged, but developing countries need hundreds of billions every single year to address loss and damage. And even when money is promised, much of it comes with conditions, bureaucracy, and loans deepening debt instead of repairing damage. Finance becomes another side where colonial patterns repeat. The global south must plead for resources to recover from harms that it did not create. Now we will speak to Rafay about how climate finance often reinforces the very inequalities it's meant to fix.
So, again, like when we talk about all these climate crises, we also hear a lot about the loss and damage. So there are, like eventually, when there is loss and damage, there are loss and damage funds as well. But when we talk about it in practical terms, what does meaningful restitution look like for the countries which are already facing climate devastation?
Well, you see, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities that countries face to deal with the climate crisis. This differentiated responsibility is broadly between less developed and developed states, where developed states that have benefited from resource extraction and the emissions of greenhouse gases, making themselves wealthy, are under an obligation to mitigate or reduce their greenhouse gases. And less developed countries like Pakistan, India, the global south are obligated to prepare or adapt to the oncoming climate crisis. And this is the differentiated responsibility, although it's equal. But beyond this, the implicit promise of the UNFCCC is also that developed countries provide climate finance and technology transfer to less developed countries so that they have the money and means to be able to prepare for the climate crisis, which in essence has been caused by the resource extraction, the climate colonialism that we've experienced in the last 250 years. So climate finance is an integral part of this entire United Nations climate process. In 2010, when the Conference of Parties met in Cancun, the G20 announced a climate fund that they said would capitalize to $100 billion by 2020. Well, come 2025, that fund is capitalized at less than $25 billion. And what's happened is that as a result of climate finance, first of all, not meeting the promises that have been made and being so woefully inadequate, have left developing countries without the resources to properly be able to prepare for the oncoming climate crisis. And so, for example, what we saw in Pakistan in 2022, when rains ravaged parts of Sindh and Balochistan, which don't normally experience the monsoon, and the rains were so severe that it created a 100-kilometer lake that could be seen from space. That's not an event that can be adapted or prepared for. That particular event cost Pakistan nearly $35 billion in loss and affected over 30 million Pakistanis and displaced over 10 million. What Pakistan and other countries like Pakistan experiencing severe climate impacts needed at that point was a special fund, not climate finance, but a special fund they could access that could put their communities and economies back on their feet. That was the essence of the loss and damage fund. Now, since the Loss and Damage Fund was announced in Sharm el Sheikh and COP27 in 2022, it's hardly been capitalized to the levels of money that are needed for developing countries to prepare for the climate crisis. The scale that is being reported for monies in the Climate Fund or the Climate Loss and Damage Fund are nearing trillions of dollars right now. And I should just add here for a second that while global promises for a climate fund made 15 years ago have hardly reached 30, 40, 50 billion dollars, just last year, the United States gave, not in the form of loans, gave the Ukraine and Israel over $90 billion to engage in warfare and genocide. This too is another example of climate injustice that we see in the finance system. The climate finance world right now is deeply unequal. There's not enough money, and there are too many countries vying for those funds for it to be equitably distributed amongst the countries that need them most.
So again, like when we talk about these loss and damage funds, we also get to know about the unequal trade systems. Like this is inequality which comes in economy and that shows in the climate economy. So how do unequal trade systems, development loans, and old power structure keeps repeating colonial patterns within today's climate crisis?
Well, let's take the 2022 floods in Pakistan, for example. I've already mentioned that the World Bank estimated that Pakistan suffered infrastructure loss around the region of about $35 billion, which is a significant proportion of Pakistan's overall GDP. It's about 10 to 12% of Pakistan's GDP. Our economy had a hole blown out of it due to an event which was over 50% caused by climate change. The Imperial College in London ran a weather attribution that said over 50% of the intensity of the rain that fell in Balochistan and Sindh was caused by the climate change. So there wasn't a natural event that impacted Pakistanis. It was a man-made climate event caused by the greenhouse gas emissions of the global north. Now, in answer to that, when the United Nations put out a rescue and relief fund call in September, October 2022, about $400 million were raised. I should also point out that a couple of years ago, when the church, the Notre Dame Church in Paris, burnt down, within weeks the church received about $1 billion in donations and aid. Nevertheless, in December 2022, when Pakistan convened a donors conference in Switzerland called the Geneva Convention and invited global countries to fulfill their promises to climate finance and loss and damage to Pakistan, about $10 billion were pledged. But of these billions of dollars, most were loans. So Pakistanis suffering the climate crisis are now indebted so that they can put their economies and communities back on their feet. And this is, again, massive climate injustice. And what we see around the world, countries falling into this form of climate debt, where instead of getting the assistance and grants and as you said, retribution due from global north countries, we're getting money in the form of loans and indebting our nations and our people going forward.
Now, this brings me to my next question, and I'm very interested to find out that what exactly is going on when it comes to climate finance. So even when climate finance is promised, like we go to all these summits, there is an entire budget. There's a portion of budget that has been dedicated to climate crisis. So even when the type finance is promised, so much of it gets stuck in conditions, loans, or bureaucracy. Why is the system designed this way? Are we not aware that the climate is deteriorating and we need to do something about it sooner than later?
Again, the same capital and colonial and consumer structures that brought us here since the Industrial Revolution live and thrive today. The Dutch East India Company was getting nutmegs from Indonesia, making people wealthy in the Netherlands while conducting genocides on the Banda Islands for the control of those spices. The East India Company conducted a drug racket with China, depriving the Indian provinces of Bengal and Bihar of rice and replacing them with the production of opium, leading to large-scale famines in the 1800s, again done by a country using colonial and capital processes. We see that today when, after 2022, Shell Corporation, one of the largest greenhouse gas producers in the world, in 1 year posted a $40 billion profit. One company, the same year Pakistan suffered a $35 billion loss, one company made $40 billion in profit, doing the same resource extraction in other parts of the world and causing greenhouse gases to be expended in other parts of the world, creating wealth in the hands of a few, creating poverty and climate unresilience and vulnerability for the global majority. We see those same processes being played out, and unless you unravel and address the colonial capital and consumerist forces that have driven the climate crisis, there's not much you can do to be able to fix it.
The next frontier is the law. Can countries like Pakistan hold major emitters legally accountable? The Paris Agreement recognizes loss and damage but includes language preventing liability or compensation claims. That means the treaty does not currently offer a direct legal pathway. But the conversation is changing. International courts, human rights bodies, and community-led lawsuits are increasingly treating climate harm as a legal liability. Now we will speak to Rafay about whether the law can finally catch up to climate reality and what real accountability could look like.
So, from a legal perspective, do current international frameworks like the Paris Agreement actually allow vulnerable countries to hold major emitters accountable, or are they too weak by design? And again, the COP30 is happening right now, and the indigenous
Yeah.
communities are protesting it because of a couple of reasons. Because there is one factor of cleaning the forest area, the parts of forest, so that the people can reach to the summit. Other things, that indigenous representation is near to zero on these in these rooms. So from a legal perspective, I want you to explain that, are international frameworks catching up? Are they including the people being affected by the climate actually, or is it just people, suited booted people sitting in rooms and deciding the futures of people?
It's very important to note that almost all international law is cooperative. There are very few areas where there is actual accountability. And the United Nations Framework Convention and indeed the Paris Agreement is an example of this. The Paris Agreement just requires countries to submit their greatest ambition to greenhouse gas reduction as they can. There's no limit or accountability if they don't do their best. It is a voluntary system at the end of the day. And as far as the Conference of Parties that meets under the United Nations Framework Convention, I quote my friend and mentor, Dr. Adil Najam, who's currently the chair of the World Wildlife Foundation. He says if you try to do something 30 times and it hasn't worked, you have to look at what you're trying to do. If the objective of the Conference of Parties is the stabilization of greenhouse gases, that's certainly not happened, even though they've met 30 times. And perhaps it is time to step back for a second, look at the scale of the climate crisis, and then look at this United Nations framework, the games and rules that we have to address this, and ask ourselves the question whether this is actually working or not. The COP process that I've attended in the past few years, I've seen riddled with lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry. It's certainly not representative of communities. The Conference of Parties at Sharm el Sheikh, in Dubai, and in Baku were so far away from cities, were so heavily guarded and protected that almost no local representation actually entered the negotiation rooms.
So again, this brings me to my next question, and that is, okay, there is growing talk about treating climate harm as a legal liability. So could we ever see big polluters or nations face consequences in the international courts? What would it take for that to happen? And I
Well,
want you to,
there
and
has
I'm
been.
sorry, I'm just sorry, I just need to add one thing. I want you to mention that how when Trump got into power this year, he pulled USA out of Paris Agreement, and USA is one of the biggest emitters.
Well, that's perhaps a different question. You're absolutely right. The role of the United States in this entire process is most questionable. I mean, you have to go back to when the United Nations Framework Convention had been signed on in 1992, and there were discussions on how to roll it out. That it was the United States that actually suggested using the framework of something called the Montreal Protocol, which was an international agreement meant to deal with chlorofluorocarbons that were causing a hole in the ozone layer. At that point in the 1990s, the Montreal Convention was considered a success because it used market-based techniques and market-based mechanisms to reduce the usage of these chlorofluorocarbons and replace them with more sustainable gases. And so that was the market-based approach that was used by the Conference of Parties putting together the Kyoto Protocol and indeed the Paris Agreement. And when the Kyoto Protocol in 1996 was announced that actually had mandatory caps on emissions, the United States stepped out. George Bush Sr. refused to sign on to the Kyoto Protocol, saying that he wouldn't do anything that would affect the American people's way of life. And it wasn't until the Paris Agreement, when Barack Obama was president, that his envoy John Kerry agreed to sign on to or back on to the United Nations process through the Paris Agreement, but insisted that the Paris Agreement, which sought to reduce or cap global temperatures at 1.5 degrees centigrade, John Kerry said that the United States would only ratify the Paris Agreement if it was voluntary, not mandatory. And based on the condition that they were bringing the United States into the UN climate fold, the countries agreed to have the Paris Agreement a voluntary arrangement. And sure enough, after the 2016 elections, when Donald Trump was sworn in, one of the first things he did was to take America out of the Paris Agreement. So their role in not participating in the one solution that we have, as flawed as the COP process may be, is an indictment of the role of the United States in not stopping the climate crisis as rapidly as it could. That's for sure. Now,
And
your question was more specific to that,
yeah,
though.
my question is like that there is a lot of conversation that is happening
Yes,
about
I got it.
treating climate
With
harm.
respect to with respect to legality.
International courts.
Well, there has been a recent International Court of Justice opinion on climate change where it is indicated that countries that don't fulfill their promises will be committing environmental crimes and indeed potentially international crimes. But it won't be until the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court allow the prosecution of ecocide, as it were, the knowing destruction of the environment as one of the crimes against humanity, such as genocide, that you won't see real accountability. And I hope that day comes soon, as a matter of fact. There is already a petition in the ICJ and International Criminal Court to change these international humanitarian laws to include ecocide as a prosecutable case.
This brings me to my last question, and last question is something that I really look forward. Like I ask this to every environmental lawyer that I meet, and I don't find much hope, but I really hope that we find something at least to hold on to. So, looking ahead, what legal or structural changes would genuinely shift the burden away from vulnerable countries and place it on the actors who are responsible for the crisis, or maybe find a solution that suits everyone in the region?
Well, look, this is beyond law because it has been the forces of capitalism, consumerism, and colonialism that have shaped not just our societies in the last 150 years, but indeed our legal systems. The legal systems follow these practices. And so, like I said earlier, unless we address and replace the forces of capitalism and colonialism and consumerism that are driving the climate crisis, you won't get a legal response to it. You have to unbundle this rapacious and unaccountable extraction and destruction of natural resources and the abuse of human labor to create profit in the hands of the few. This system that we have, that we aspire to, has to be unbundled, and a new, more equitable, more friendly, more sustainable system needs to be put into place. This is not an overnight system. This is not an overnight play. This is going to take years and decades to play out because there are immense forces of wealth that drive the world right now that need to be stopped and reversed. And then the laws will follow suit. And indeed, by that point in time, 100 years ago, slavery was legal. The laws don't follow forth. The laws come afterwards. You have to change people's opinions and change people's beliefs and change society before the laws change. And that's the thing we have to do first.
Thank you so much, Rafi, for your time. This has been a very insightful conversation, and we hope to see you again in some other episode because climate colonialism is a very broad term. It needs a lot more discussion. And in countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, South Asia as whole, South Africa as whole, we really need to have these conversations so we know what is going on in the world. Thank you so much, and see you in the next episode.
Climate colonialism teaches us one thing. Climate justice is not only about cutting emissions, it's about rewriting systems built on inequality. The past shaped the crisis, but the decisions we make now will shape who survives it. For Pakistan, the fight for climate justice is also a fight for fairness. The people who lose homes, crops, and livelihood must also gain the power to shape how the world responds. It means climate finance that reaches communities, not just files and ministries. It means laws that protect the vulnerable, not the powerful. And it means a global climate system that does not repeat the inequalities of the past. You are watching Front Seat to Climate Change on Dawn News TV. I am Aleezeh Fatima.